The little black girl whispered to the biker she heard her mom crying beneath the steel floorboards last night. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now let's dive into the story. On a chilly Wednesday night, a little girl ran through the darkened streets, barefoot and frantic. Her name was Aisha Coleman, and at just 8 years old, her life had already been stained by fear and desperation. She ran toward the small gathering of bikers parked outside the local carnival grounds. The sound of roaring engines had always been a comfort to her, but tonight, the rumble of motorcycles seemed like a lifeline she desperately needed. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she approached the group, clutching her small fists in front of her chest. "Please," she gasped, her voice trembling. "You have to help. My mom, she's under the floorboards. I can hear her crying." The bikers, who had just finished volunteering at the carnival food booth, stopped what they were doing, exchanging confused glances. It was a quiet night, the only sound being the distant hum of the fairgrounds and the soft clink of metal chains on the bikes. The moment Aisha spoke, however, everything changed. Jack "Hawk" Morrison, the leader of the Iron Riders, stepped forward, his eyes scanning the girl with a mix of concern and suspicion. "What do you mean?" he asked, his deep voice carrying the weight of years of experience. Aisha looked up at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and hope. "She's under the steel floorboards," Aisha whispered, her voice barely audible over the noise of the engines. "She won't wake up. I tried everything. I don't know what to do." Jack's heart sank. There was something in her voice, in the way she looked at him, that told him this wasn't a prank. This little girl was in real danger. The other bikers, some of whom had heard stories about Aisha's mother, stood still, processing the information. They knew the Colemans, or at least, they thought they did. Rick Coleman, Aisha's father, had been a respected member of their club years ago. But 5 years ago, he had left the club, seeking a quieter life for his family. And now, the bikers were hearing about his daughter in the most desperate of circumstances. "We need to go now," Jack said, his voice firm. "Where is she?" Aisha pointed toward the edge of the carnival grounds, toward a rundown house barely visible through the trees. "It's just down that road. Please, hurry." Without a second thought, Jack turned to the others, his voice steady but urgent. "Let's go. We're not leaving until she's safe." The bikers quickly mounted their Harleys, the engines roaring to life in a synchronized roar that seemed to shake the very ground beneath them. The group sped off toward the house, their headlights cutting through the darkness. As they rode, Jack's mind raced. What had happened? Why hadn't anyone heard anything about this before? And what could be hidden beneath the floorboards of that crumbling house? Of old boards. "There," she whispered, her voice breaking. "That's where she is." Jack knelt down and pried the boards away, revealing the trapdoor beneath. His heart raced as he unlatched it, the heavy metal door creaking open. He could hear faint sounds of crying from below, muffled by the steel floorboards. Without hesitation, he climbed down into the darkness, the rest of the bikers following him. The scene that awaited them was worse than Jack could have ever imagined. As Jack descended into the cold darkness beneath the steel floorboards, a heavy silence surrounded him. The faint sound of crying grew louder, filling the space with a sense of urgency. His heart pounded as he adjusted his eyes to the dim light filtering through the cracks in the old structure. The others followed close behind, their footsteps muffled as they made their way down. Aisha's trembling voice echoed softly in the distance. "Mom? Mom, can you hear me?" Jack moved quickly, his fingers brushing against the cold metal, trying to locate the source of the sound. His flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls of the narrow room. He could see her now, her frail form curled up in the corner, her face pale and eyes wide with fear. Her breathing was shallow, labored, and she barely acknowledged his presence as he approached. "Ma'am, I'm Jack," he said softly, his voice calm but urgent. "We're here to help. Can you hear me?" The woman, weak and disoriented, tried to lift her head, but her strength failed her. "Please, my kids," she whispered, her voice barely audible, the words broken by shallow gasps for air. Jack's chest tightened as he crouched beside her, assessing her condition. Her skin was cold to the touch, and her body trembled with a fever he could feel even through the thick layers of clothing. He motioned to one of the bikers behind him. "Vince, get in here," he ordered. Vince, the club's medic, quickly moved in, his hands steady and practiced. "We need to get her stabilized, fast. She's severely malnourished, dehydrated, and the symptoms point to a severe case of neglect. We need to get her to a hospital immediately." Jack nodded, his mind already racing through the options. He knew this wasn't just a simple case of a sick woman. It was something far darker. The woman's condition wasn't just the result of a few days of neglect. This was a life lived in constant fear, a life slowly being drained of hope. The weight of it all pressed down on him, but there was no time for doubt. Aisha, standing in the doorway, watching her mother with a mixture of fear and hope, tugged at his sleeve. "Please, don't let her die," she whispered, her small voice breaking. Jack looked at the girl, her face streaked with tears. The bikers had faced their share of violence, of confrontation, but nothing had ever felt as heavy as this moment. He gave her a reassuring nod, even though the truth weighed heavily on his heart. "We're not leaving her here. We're going to take her somewhere safe, all right?" Aisha nodded, wiping her eyes, her fragile hope resting on him. You promised to save her." Jack swallowed hard, his own emotions threatening to break through. He had no promises to make, not when he didn't know what was going to happen next. But he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let this little girl down. He stood up, turning to his crew. "We move fast. Vince, stay with her. The rest of us will get everything ready to go." As Vince began working on the woman, administering fluids to rehydrate her and check her vital signs, Jack looked at the rest of the group. Bear, a towering figure with a heart as big as his muscles, stepped forward. "I'll take the bike to go get help," he volunteered. Jack hesitated for a moment. They needed a hospital, but calling an ambulance could draw unwanted attention, and the last thing they needed was the police getting involved before they could get the woman to safety. "No," Jack said firmly. "We're not risking a hospital just yet. We'll take her to a place where we know she'll be safe." The others nodded in agreement. They had all been in situations like this before. Dangerous, uncertain, but the bonds they shared as a club ran deep, and they knew when they had to act. Jack turned to Aisha. "Come here, kiddo. We're going to get you and your mom out of here." He gently lifted Aisha into his arms, cradling her against his chest as they carefully made their way back to the entrance. As they emerged from the trapdoor and into the cold night air, Jack's mind raced with the decisions that lay ahead. The house was falling apart around them, and it wasn't just the structure that was broken, it was everything. The family, once whole, was now fractured, left to survive in the aftermath of neglect, abuse, and betrayal. But Jack knew one thing. He wouldn't let it end here. Not while he still had breath in his lungs. He looked around at his brothers and sisters in the club, each one ready to ride into whatever darkness they had to face. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. And the next move would come with a price. As the bikers fired up their engines and the roar of motorcycles filled the night, Jack felt a sense of determination surge through him. This wasn't just about getting the woman to safety. It was about giving Aisha a chance at a better life, a life free from fear and pain. And that was something he would fight for. The road ahead was long, and the dangers were real. But for the first time in a long time, Jack had hope. And he wasn't about to let it slip away. As the motorcycles roared down the dark highway, Jack's mind raced, every twist and turn bringing them closer to their destination. The woman, Aisha's mother, was still unconscious in the back of one of the bikers' vans, her condition still critical despite the efforts to stabilize her. The weight of the situation pressed on Jack's shoulders, but he refused to show it. He had made a promise, and he wasn't about to let anyone down. The small crew of bikers moved like a single, united force, cutting through the night with precision. Every headlight and rev of the engine cut through the oppressive darkness, creating a wall of sound that echoed in the otherwise silent night. They had been riding for hours now, the miles stretching out behind them like a never-ending ribbon of blacktop. Jack glanced in the rearview mirror, catching sight of Aisha. She was nestled in the back of the van, still wide-eyed and silent. The fear in her gaze hadn't left, but there was something else now, something fragile, but hopeful. He hoped it was hope. He couldn't remember the last time he'd been this focused, this driven. His usual doubts and second-guessing were nowhere to be found. For the first time in years, Jack felt like he had a purpose that was bigger than just the club, bigger than himself. This was about saving Aisha's future, giving her the chance she deserved to live without fear. The road ahead seemed endless, but Jack's determination was unwavering. The club had agreed it was all she could do, but in that moment, it meant everything. The bikers settled into the cabin for the night, taking turns to stand guard. Jack remained outside for a while, sitting on the porch, staring into the night. His mind kept drifting back to the chaos they had just escaped from, and the uncertainty that lay ahead. The world wasn't going to let them get away with this. The world was going to come after them, come after Aisha's mother. He wasn't sure who would come first, the cops, the people behind her abuse, or something darker. But Jack was done running. He wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not when they had come this far. As the moon climbed higher in the sky, the weight of the promise he had made to Tyrone years ago pressed down on him. It had been a promise to protect his family, his brother's daughter. Tyrone had died in his arms, and Jack had sworn to look out for Aisha, no matter what it took. "We'll figure this out," Jack murmured to himself, his voice barely above a whisper. "We'll fix this. For you, Tyrone. For Aisha." The night stretched on, silent and still, but Jack couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of a long and dangerous road. Aisha's life had been shattered, and there were those who would do anything to make sure she stayed in the dark. But the Iron Riders were done letting people fall through the cracks. They were done being silent. Tomorrow, they would take the next step. But tonight, they would rest, because in the morning, the real battle would begin. The next morning came with an eerie stillness. The night had been long, and the weight of their situation settled heavily on Jack's shoulders. He had promised Aisha he would keep her safe, but promises like these never came without a price. As the sun slowly climbed over the horizon, the bikers who had spent the night in the cabin began to stir, their eyes tired but vigilant. Jack stood at the window, watching the first light of day filter through the trees, his mind racing. The previous night's ride had been hard, but the hardest part was yet to come. He turned back to see Vince, the medic, still busy checking the woman's vitals. She was stable now, but just barely. Her body was weak, and her pulse was still faint, but at least she wasn't in immediate danger. Jack stepped forward, pulling on his leather jacket, his movements slow, deliberate. Aisha had fallen asleep in a corner, her small form curled up on a couch, clutching the worn jacket of one of the bikers. She looked so much younger when she slept, free from the fear and worry that had dominated her life for so long. But Jack knew it wasn't over. It would never be over. "How's she doing?" Jack asked quietly, his voice cutting through the silence. Vince looked up, his face grim. "She's holding on. But she needs more than we can give her here. We need to get her to a hospital, and soon. I don't know how much longer she can go without proper care." Jack nodded, his heart heavy. He knew what needed to be done, but the situation was complicated. Aisha's stepfather was a cop, and that alone made everything more dangerous. They couldn't trust anyone outside their circle, not yet. Not until they had more answers. "We can't go to a hospital." "Not yet," Jack said, his voice low. "We have to keep her here for now. We'll move her when we have a plan." The room fell silent as everyone processed his words. Bear, the big man who had been keeping watch outside, spoke up, his voice deep and serious. "What's the play, Jack? What are we doing next?" Jack ran a hand over his face, his mind shifting gears. He wasn't used to feeling so lost. Normally, when things went south, they acted fast, and they acted with force. But this situation was different. There was a little girl to protect, and a woman who had been through too much. "We wait," Jack said finally, his voice steady. "We wait until we can figure out where her stepfather is and what he's planning. We don't make any moves until we're ready." As the bikers settled into a tense quiet, Jack paced back and forth, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. Aisha's mother was still unconscious, and the hours seemed to drag on, each one filled with uncertainty. Jack's mind kept returning to the promise he'd made to Tyrone all those years ago. Tyrone had been a brother to him, someone he would have gone to hell and back for. Jack had sworn to protect his daughter, but now, looking at Aisha, he realized just how much he had underestimated the depth of that promise. She was just a child, and already, she had been forced to carry the weight of the world. But Jack wasn't about to let her bear that burden alone. As the morning wore on, the bikers began to gather in the small living room, their voices low as they discussed their options. The house was quiet except for the occasional murmur of the woman's labored breathing. The sound of boots on the wooden floors was the only other noise, a constant reminder that time was slipping away. Jack turned to Phantom, a high school teacher by day and a biker by night. I need you to keep an eye on her stepfather. He's going to come looking for her sooner or later. I want to know everything about him, where he is, who he's talking to, and what he's planning. Phantom nodded, already pulling out his phone to begin his search. I'll make sure we're ready. I'll dig up whatever I can on him. Jack turned to the rest of the group. We stay together. We keep our eyes open, and we don't trust anyone outside of this room. We have to make sure Aisha and her mom are safe before we make any more moves. As the bikers went to work, Jack stood by the window, watching the world outside as it slowly came to life. The calm of the morning was a stark contrast to the storm of emotions brewing inside him. He had always been a man of action, but now, more than ever, he needed to think before he acted. The stakes were higher than they had ever been before. It wasn't just about loyalty to the club anymore. It was about keeping a promise. And no matter what happened, Jack was going to make sure that promise was kept. Hours passed, and the air in the cabin grew heavy with tension. Jack kept his eyes on Aisha, who had woken up by now, her eyes darting around the room, uncertain of what was happening. She looked at him, and for a moment, their eyes locked. There was a quiet understanding between them. Jack's mind shifted to the future. The question of what came next hung over them all. Whatever happened, he knew one thing for sure. They weren't leaving Aisha behind. They would face whatever came their way together, no matter the cost. The following day dawned with a sense of unease hanging in the air. Jack stood by the window, staring out at the thick fog that had settled over the area. The bikers had spent the night in silence, taking shifts to keep watch and ensuring the safety of Aisha and her mother. The sun barely managed to break through the haze, casting a muted light over the cabin. Vince, the club's medic, had done everything he could to stabilize Aisha's mother, but there was a deep concern on his face that Jack couldn't ignore. The woman was still weak, barely conscious, her body fighting the toll of the abuse she had endured. Jack paced the floor, his thoughts running in circles. He had promised Tyrone that he would protect his family, and now, here they were, stuck in a race against time. Aisha's stepfather, a decorated cop, had made it clear that he would stop at nothing to get her back. The problem was bigger than just one man. It was a system that protected him. Jack knew they couldn't stay in the cabin forever. It wasn't just the stepfather who posed a threat. It was the people who would protect him. He needed a plan, and fast. He turned to the bikers, who had gathered in the living room. We need to move her, Jack said, his voice steady but with an underlying urgency. Vince, how's she doing? Vince sighed, wiping the sweat from his forehead. She's hanging in there, but we can't keep her here for too long. She needs real medical attention. The longer we wait, the worse it gets. Jack nodded. We're moving her. But we're not going to a hospital. Not yet. We need to figure out where her stepfather is first. Bear, the club's enforcer, crossed his arms and leaned against the wall. You really think we can just keep her hidden from him? He's a cop, Jack. He's got resources. He's going to find us. I know, Jack replied, his voice low. But right now, we have to make sure she's safe before we make any more moves. We're not getting caught in the open. We have to stay one step ahead of him. The bikers nodded in agreement. The tension in the room palpable. They all understood the stakes. This wasn't just about saving Aisha's mother. It was about protecting their own. Jack turned to Phantom, the club member who had been tasked with finding information on the stepfather. What did you find out? Phantom glanced up from his phone, his expression grim. I've dug into his background, and it's worse than we thought. He's got connections, high-level ones. People who owe him favors. It's not just about getting Aisha back. He's got a network that'll help him track us down if we're not careful. Jack's stomach tightened. He had known things were complicated, but this was beyond what he had expected. They couldn't just hide forever. They had to make their move. We'll have to go off the grid, Jack said, his mind racing with ideas. We move fast, we move smart. We need to get her to a safe house, one that's off the radar. But where? Bear asked. Where can we go that's truly safe? Jack thought for a moment. He knew of a place. A cabin deep in the mountains. Isolated, no one would find them there. It wasn't a permanent solution, but it was a start. I know a place. It's a few hundred miles out. We can keep her there until we figure out what to do next. Sounds like a plan, Vince said. But we need to move quickly. Her condition isn't improving, and if we're going to get her out of here, we need to do it now. Let's do it then, Jack said. We get her out of here. No more waiting. The bikers quickly packed up, gathering their gear and preparing for the journey. They didn't have much time to waste, and Jack knew they would be riding straight into danger. But it was the only choice they had. As the bikers revved their engines and prepared to leave, Jack paused for a moment, looking back at the cabin one last time. Aisha and her mother had been through so much, and the road ahead would be just as dangerous. But Jack wasn't going to let anything stop him. He had made a promise, and he was going to keep it, no matter what. We ride fast, we ride hard, Jack said, his voice firm. And we get her to safety. The engines roared to life, the sound cutting through the quiet. Morning air? Jack's heart was heavy, but his resolve was stronger than ever. They had a long road ahead of them, and they weren't stopping until Aisha and her mother were safe. The convoy of bikes sped off into the distance, their headlights cutting through the fog as they made their way toward the mountains, leaving the threats and dangers behind them. But Jack knew that the hardest part was yet to come. The ride to the safe house was long and grueling. The sun had risen fully now, casting a hazy light over the land as Jack and the bikers cut through the winding roads, their engines rumbling in perfect unison. The convoy of motorcycles moved in a tight formation, cutting through the quiet morning air like a blade. Jack kept his focus on the road, his knuckles tight around the handlebars. Every turn, every mile, his thoughts raced, about Aisha, about her mother, and about the dangers they still faced. They had barely escaped the grip of the law, and now, with the added threat of her stepfather hunting them, the stakes had never been higher. Aisha's mother was in the back of one of the vans, still unconscious but breathing steadily. Vince, the club's medic, had done what he could for her, but they couldn't afford to slow down. Jack could feel the weight of the promise he had made to Tyrone pressing on him with every mile. He had sworn to protect Tyrone's daughter, and even though the odds seemed insurmountable, he wasn't about to break that promise. The journey was tough. The roads became rougher, the terrain more unpredictable as they made their way deeper into the mountains. Jack looked in the rearview mirror, catching a glimpse of Aisha. She was still quiet, sitting in the van next to her mother, her small frame hunched over. It broke Jack's heart to see her like this. So young, so vulnerable, caught in the crossfire of a world that had been cruel to her. He wanted to reach out, tell her everything would be okay, but he knew better. The truth was, he didn't know what the next few hours would bring. They had no idea if her stepfather would catch up to them, or if they'd even make it to the safe house without running into trouble. As they drove on, Jack's mind kept returning to the one thing he couldn't shake, the feeling that this was just the beginning. They were still being hunted, and her stepfather wasn't going to stop until he got her back. Jack shook the thought out of his mind. He couldn't afford to think that way. Not now. Not when they were so close to safety. The convoy finally reached a secluded area, hidden deep in the mountains. The roads became narrow, with dense trees lining both sides, and Jack knew they were getting close. As they made the final turn toward the cabin, the air grew cooler, the sound of their engines becoming muffled by the thick trees surrounding them. The safe house was a small, nondescript cabin, tucked away at the foot of the mountains, far from any main roads. It was a place the club used in emergencies, far enough off the grid to remain hidden from prying eyes. Jack felt a small sense of relief wash over him as they pulled into the clearing outside the cabin. They had made it. But as he looked around, that sense of relief was quickly replaced by a gnawing feeling in the pit of his stomach. They had only bought themselves a little time. Aisha's stepfather was still out there, and Jack knew it wouldn't take long for him to find out where they were. All right, let's move her inside, Jack said, his voice calm but commanding. Vince, stay with her. Make sure she's comfortable. Vince nodded, already making his way to the van to check on Aisha's mother. We'll need to keep a close eye on her. She's still not out of the woods yet. The rest of the bikers began unloading the vans and securing the perimeter around the cabin. Jack's eyes swept over the area, making sure everything was in place. They couldn't afford to be careless, not with the stakes so high. As the group worked quickly to get everything set up, Jack couldn't help but feel the weight of the situation settle back on his shoulders. They had made it this far, but the real battle was just beginning. He knew that their enemies weren't just the people chasing them. They were the very systems that allowed abuse to thrive. It wasn't just about protecting Aisha now. It was about taking a stand against the forces that tried to destroy her. Aisha stepped out of the van, her face still pale, but there was a small spark in her eyes that hadn't been there before. She was starting to trust them, and that trust was something Jack wasn't going to break. He walked over to her, kneeling down to her level. "You okay, kid?" Aisha nodded, her small hand clutching the hem of her shirt. "I think so. It's just so much." Jack smiled softly, trying to offer her some comfort. "Yeah, I know. But you're safe here. We've got you." Aisha looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and hope. "Will Mom be okay?" Jack's heart clenched, but he held her gaze. "We're doing everything we can. You're going to see her get better, I promise." The cabin was small but well-maintained, with a fireplace in the corner and enough space for everyone to settle in. It wasn't much, but it would keep them hidden for a while. Vince had already begun to work on Aisha's mother, administering fluids and checking her vitals. "She's stable for now," Vince said, his voice calm but laced with concern. "But she's been through a lot. We need to keep her here for a while." Jack nodded. "We'll stay as long as we need to." As the bikers made themselves comfortable in the cabin, Jack sat by the fire, his mind still racing. The calm of the mountain air didn't ease the storm inside his chest. They had a lot of work to do, and time was running out. He had made a promise to keep Aisha safe, but the real question was, could they survive long enough to fulfill it? The night was heavy with tension, the air thick with the weight of uncertainty. Jack sat by the fire in the small, dimly lit cabin, his eyes fixed on the flickering flames. Aisha and her mother were asleep in the back room, and Vince had done everything he could to keep her stable, but Jack knew the woman's recovery was far from guaranteed. They had barely made it this far, and now, as the bikers settled in for a night of uneasy rest, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. Aisha's stepfather would not let them go so easily. He had been a cop, after all, and a man with those kinds of connections wouldn't be easily thwarted. Jack's mind wandered back to the promise he had made to Tyrone all those years ago, standing beside his brother's grave, swearing to protect his daughter no matter what. But that promise felt like a burden now. The world they were living in was darker than he had ever imagined. He heard the crunch of boots on gravel outside, followed by the sound of a low voice calling his name. It was Bear, the club's enforcer. "You good, Jack?" Bear asked, stepping inside, his tall frame blocking the doorway. Jack looked up, giving him a weary smile. "Just thinking." Bear walked over and sat down next to him, his eyes scanning the room. "I get it. We're all thinking. But you've got to get some rest, man. We're in a good spot right now. We've got a plan." Jack shook his head. "I can't. Not yet. We're sitting ducks here, Bear. If her stepfather finds us," Bear interrupted him. "We won't let him find us. We're ready for whatever comes next. We stick to the plan. We don't go out there half-cocked. We wait for the right moment." Jack leaned back in his chair, staring at the fire. He knew Bear was right, but the doubt gnawed at him. They had no idea how much time they had before the storm hit. The fire crackled, and for a brief moment, Jack allowed himself to relax. The warmth from the flames reached out, comforting him. But the moment didn't last long. His thoughts returned to Aisha. He thought about the fear she had carried with her for so long, how she had looked up at him with such trust in her eyes. She was still just a child. And here she was, in the middle of a nightmare, with no clear way out. Jack rubbed his face, exhausted. "I just don't know if we're doing enough," he muttered. Bear's voice was calm but firm. "You're doing more than enough. You got her this far, and you're not going to stop now." Jack sighed. "I don't know how to fix this. I'm not sure what the next step is." Bear's hand landed firmly on Jack's shoulder. "One step at a time, brother. We're in this together. You're not alone in this fight." Jack nodded slowly, appreciating the reassurance. They had a plan, sort of. They were keeping Aisha and her mother hidden for now, but Jack knew they couldn't stay in the cabin forever. They would need to move, but where to? He glanced at Bear, then back at the fire. "What about Phantom? Has he found anything else on her stepfather?" Bear's expression darkened slightly. "He's been digging, but it's like he's vanished. We know he's a cop, but his tracks are well covered. Phantom's on it, though. He's not giving up." Jack let out a long breath. "Good. We need to know everything we can about this guy. We can't afford any surprises." Bear stood, patting Jack on the back. "We'll get there. I've got your back. We all do. With that, Bear stepped out, leaving Jack to his thoughts. As the door closed behind him, Jack sat in silence, his mind racing with possibilities. The room felt too small, the walls closing in around him. There were too many risks, too many unknowns. He had to keep his focus, stay sharp, but the weight of the situation was beginning to wear on him. The cabin was still, and for a brief moment, he allowed himself to drift. Aisha's face flashed before his eyes. She was so young, so innocent. She didn't deserve any of this. And yet, here she was, caught in a vicious cycle she couldn't escape. Jack's chest tightened with frustration. He couldn't change the past, but he could control what happened next. They would fight. They would protect Aisha and her mother, no matter the cost. Jack stood up, pacing the room as his thoughts solidified into a plan. They would leave at dawn. They would head toward the mountains, deep into territory that even her stepfather wouldn't know about. He could feel it in his bones. They couldn't stay here any longer. The next move had to be calculated, careful, but it had to be made soon. The storm was coming, and Jack was ready. As the fire began to die down, Jack stepped outside, his boots crunching on the gravel. The cool mountain air hit his face, and for the first time in days, he felt a small sliver of clarity. They weren't alone in this fight. The club was his family, and they would face whatever came next together. With the moon high in the sky, Jack made his way to the back of the cabin, where Aisha and her mother lay. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but he knew this. He would protect them. They were going to survive this. He wouldn't let anything take that away from them. The morning air was crisp, and the sky was painted with the faintest hint of orange as the first light of dawn broke through the trees. Jack stood at the front of the cabin, his eyes scanning the horizon. They had spent the night in silence, waiting for the moment to move. Aisha's mother was still resting, her condition stabilized for now, but there was no telling how long they could keep her hidden. They couldn't stay in the cabin much longer. Jack had made a decision. Today, they were leaving. They had to get to a safer location, deeper into the mountains, where no one could find them. But as he looked out over the landscape, he knew that even in these quiet moments, danger was never far behind. He heard the sound of motorcycles roaring to life behind him, the other bikers ready to go. The convoy was packed and prepared. The plan was set, but Jack felt the weight of it all pressing on him. He had promised to keep Aisha and her mother safe, but the deeper they went, the more complicated the situation became. Aisha was still a child, and the things she had already endured were too much for anyone to bear. But there was no turning back now. Jack walked toward the others, his face set in determination. "We move out in 15, he called to the group. "Stay sharp. We're not out of the woods yet." The bikers nodded, and as they readied their bikes, the air grew thick with anticipation. The plan was simple. Head to the mountains, find a more secure location, and lay low. The further they moved from the town, the safer they would be. They couldn't afford to make any mistakes. Jack looked over at Aisha, who was sitting by the cabin door, clutching her mother's jacket tightly. Her eyes were red from crying, but she didn't say a word. Jack walked over to her, kneeling down to her level. "You ready, kiddo?" he asked softly. Aisha nodded, though her small face was etched with worry. "I'm scared," she whispered. Jack smiled gently, trying to reassure her. "I know, kid. I know. But we're not going to let anything happen to you. We'll get through this." Aisha looked up at him, her eyes filled with uncertainty, but also a hint of trust. "You promised," she said, her voice trembling. Jack's heart clenched at the sound of her words. He had made that promise, and now, more than ever, he intended to keep it. He stood and motioned for her to follow him. "Come on. Let's get you and your mom to safety." As they all gathered at the bikes, the convoy began to move. The engines roared to life, and they sped down the narrow mountain road, leaving the cabin behind them. The landscape around them shifted as they ascended higher, the trees growing thicker and the air colder. Jack kept his eyes on the road, but his mind kept returning to the same question: how long before her stepfather caught up to them? He knew he couldn't outrun the man forever. He had connections, power, and resources. Jack's gut told him they were on borrowed time. As they rode deeper into the mountains, Jack glanced at his rearview mirror, scanning the distance for any sign of danger. The convoy was tight, and they kept their speed high, weaving through the winding roads. He could see the concern in his brothers' faces, but they didn't speak. There was no need for words. They were all in this together, and they knew it. The miles passed slowly, the landscape changing as they moved higher into the rugged wilderness. The roads became less traveled, the signs of civilization fading away. Jack could feel the tension lift slightly. They were getting farther from the danger. They were getting closer to safety. But the further they went, the more his instincts told him they needed to be cautious. It wasn't enough to just run. They had to prepare for what might come next. Jack signaled for the convoy to slow down as they neared a secluded spot in the forest, a small clearing surrounded by dense trees. It was isolated, quiet, and most importantly, hidden. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The bikers parked their motorcycles in the clearing, dismounting and checking the area for any signs of trouble. Jack felt his muscles tense as he surveyed the surroundings. They couldn't afford to be complacent, not now. He walked over to Vince, who had been checking on Aisha's mother during the ride. "How's she holding up?" Jack asked. Vince shook his head. "She's still weak, but stable. She needs real care, Jack. We're pushing our luck here." Jack sighed. He knew Vince was right. They needed to get her to a hospital, but that wasn't an option yet. They couldn't risk exposure. Jack turned to the group, his voice firm. "We stay here for a while. Let's regroup, rest, and figure out our next move. We'll keep moving in the morning." As the bikers settled in, Jack found a quiet spot near the trees and sat down, his mind racing. They had made it this far, but there was still so much left to do. He had promised Aisha and her mother that they would make it out of this alive, but the road ahead was long, and the danger was far from over. Jack stared at the sky, the weight of responsibility heavy on his shoulders. He couldn't fail them now. He wouldn't. As the night settled in, the sound of crackling fires and hushed conversations filled the air. The convoy had made it to a temporary safe haven, but Jack knew the worst was still to come. They would have to fight for every inch of ground, and no one was going to make it easy for them. But Jack was ready. He had to be. They weren't just riding for survival. They were riding for a chance at redemption, a chance to take back control of their own lives. And no matter what happened, Jack wasn't going to let anything tear that away. The morning arrived too quickly, the sky a dull gray as the bikers gathered around the small campfire, each lost in their thoughts. Jack had been up for hours, thinking through the next move. They had to keep moving, but every part of him screamed that they weren't ready. Her stepfather, Rick, had resources, connections, and the law on his side. Jack couldn't shake the feeling that danger was closing in faster than they realized. He rubbed his eyes, still feeling the weight of his promise to protect Aisha. His head was heavy, the uncertainty of their situation hanging in the air. There was no easy answer. As the others packed up, preparing to leave, Jack turned to Vince, who had been checking on Aisha's mother. "How's she doing?" Jack asked, his voice low. Vince looked over, his expression grim. "She's holding on, but barely. I've done all I can, but we're running out of options. She needs to see a doctor soon, or it's going to get worse." Jack nodded, the reality of their situation sinking deeper into his chest. "We'll get her somewhere safe soon. Just hang in there." He turned and glanced at Aisha, who was sitting by the fire, clutching her mother's jacket tightly. Her face was pale, her eyes distant, filled with the quiet sorrow of a child who had seen too much. It broke Jack's heart to see her this way. She was so small, yet she had been forced to carry the weight of an adult's fears. He walked over to her, kneeling down to her level. "Hey, kiddo, you okay?" Aisha didn't look up at him at first, but after a moment, she spoke, her voice shaky. "Will we ever be safe?" Jack's chest tightened, and for a moment, he didn't know how to answer. He wanted to tell her everything would be okay, that they would find peace, but he couldn't promise that. "Not yet. We'll do everything we can to make sure you're safe," Jack said, his voice firm, though he knew the uncertainty was still there. "That's a promise I'll keep." Aisha looked up at him, her eyes searching his face for something to hold on to, a glimmer of hope. Jack's heart ached as he saw the vulnerability in her eyes. She was so young, and yet she had already learned how to be strong, even if it hurt her. He stood up, offering her a hand. "Come on. We're going to move soon." Aisha took his hand, her grip firm for someone so small. They were all ready to leave, to head into the unknown, but Jack couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. As the bikers readied their bikes and packed up the last of their supplies, Jack checked the perimeter one last time, his eyes scanning the trees and the road. His mind raced with all the possibilities of what could go wrong. But he couldn't let that fear show. Not to the others, and especially not to Aisha. They had to keep moving, and they had to do it fast. "All right, let's move," Jack called out, his voice commanding. The bikers revved their engines, and the convoy began its trek deeper into the mountains. Jack led the way, his mind focused on the road ahead, but his thoughts kept drifting back to Aisha and her mother. The mountains stretched out before them, a vast wilderness that would hopefully keep them hidden for a while, but Jack knew they couldn't stay in one place for long. Every road they traveled, every turn they made, could be their last if they weren't careful. The weight of the danger that followed them grew heavier with each passing mile, but Jack wasn't going to let fear stop him. The promise he had made to Tyrone and to Aisha kept him moving forward. They couldn't afford to stop now. As they traveled deeper into the mountains, the roads became rougher and the air grew colder. The landscape shifted from dense forests to jagged cliffs and winding paths. The isolation of the area worked in their favor, but it also made it harder to find help if they needed it. Jack knew this place would have to be temporary, another hiding spot, another dead end they would have to leave behind as soon as it became too dangerous. They couldn't stay in one place for too long. Hours passed as they made their way through the mountains, the ride long and tiring. But Jack kept his focus, eyes always scanning the road ahead. He had to be ready for anything. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the rugged terrain, the convoy finally reached a remote area. A secluded cabin tucked away in the valley, hidden from any prying eyes. The place was a small, unassuming structure, perfect for their needs. Jack gave the signal, and the bikers dismounted, ready to secure the area. The cabin had been used by the club for situations like this before. It was a place to lie low, to regroup, and to plan. Jack glanced around, assessing the area. "We stay here tonight," he said, his voice low. "Tomorrow, we move again. But for now, we rest. We'll be ready." The group nodded, each member understanding the gravity of the situation. They knew they couldn't afford to get comfortable, but the cabin offered a brief moment of respite. Jack turned to Aisha, who had been unusually quiet on the ride. He could see the exhaustion in her eyes, the fear that still lingered, but there was also something else, resilience. She was still holding on, still trusting him. Jack gave her a small smile. "You did good today," he said softly. Aisha looked up at him, her expression still uncertain, but she nodded. Jack's heart swelled with pride for the young girl, and he promised himself again that no matter what happened, he would protect her. They had made it this far, and Jack wasn't about to let anything take that away from them. The night settled in quietly, the distant sound of wind rustling through the trees the only thing that broke the silence. The cabin was tucked away deep in the mountains, far from civilization, and for the first time in what felt like weeks, Jack allowed himself to breathe. They were safe, for now. The bikers gathered around the small campfire outside the cabin, their faces shadowed by the flickering light. Aisha was inside, resting with her mother, who had finally regained some consciousness, though her condition was still fragile. Vince had done everything he could to stabilize her, but the reality was that they were far from a real hospital, and their chances were slim without proper medical care. Jack leaned against one of the motorcycles, his eyes scanning the darkened surroundings. The fog had rolled in again, thick and heavy, making the world feel smaller, more isolated. He couldn't shake the feeling that the calm was only temporary. The threats were still out there, lurking. He could feel it in his bones. Her stepfather was closing in. Jack stood up and walked toward the edge of the clearing, his boots crunching on the gravel. He needed to think. The plan had always been to get them to safety, but the more he thought about it, the less certain he was of how long they could stay hidden. Her stepfather wasn't just any man. He was a cop, with connections, with resources. They were just a handful of bikers, fighting against a system that had failed them. Jack took a deep breath, pushing those thoughts aside. They had a few hours of peace, at least. He couldn't waste it. As he walked back toward the fire, Bear came up to him, his large form moving with purpose. "What's the next move?" Bear asked, his voice low. Jack paused for a moment, glancing back at the cabin. "We stay here for tonight. Let Aisha's mom rest. Tomorrow, we'll figure out the next step. We can't stay here too long, though. We need to get to a safer place, farther from here." Bear nodded, understanding. "I've got the perimeter covered. We'll be ready for whatever comes our way." Jack's eyes narrowed, scanning the trees again. "I don't think we have much time." Her Her stepfather is going to come looking for us, and he won't stop until he finds her. Bear let out a low grunt. You really think he'll make it this far? I don't know, Jack said quietly, but I'm not going to wait around to find out. We need to be prepared. We have to get ahead of him. The air grew still for a moment, the weight of Jack's words settling between them. Bear finally spoke, his voice more somber than usual. We'll handle it. You know we will. Jack turned toward him, meeting his gaze. I know, but this isn't just about us anymore. It's about Aisha. We've got to keep her safe, Bear. We can't let her go back to him. Bear didn't respond right away. He simply nodded, his eyes reflecting the same determination Jack felt. They were in this together, and no matter what it took, they would make sure Aisha didn't go back to that life. The others were still sitting around the fire, talking in low voices. Jack walked over to them, feeling the weight of their eyes on him. They all understood what was at stake. The lives of Aisha and her mother were now intertwined with their own. There was no turning back. We leave at dawn, Jack said, his voice steady. We keep moving, no matter what. Stay sharp. If we see anything suspicious, we move. We don't wait. The bikers nodded, and the air was filled with the quiet sounds of preparation. They were used to riding under pressure, used to the dangers of the road, but this felt different. This wasn't just another ride. This was a fight for survival. Jack sat down on one of the logs around the fire, his mind working through the plan. They had to be smart. They had to be faster than her stepfather. They couldn't afford to slip up. As the night wore on, the fire slowly died down, and the bikers retreated into the cabin. Jack stayed outside for a few more moments, watching the stars fade behind the clouds. He couldn't help but think about what had happened to Aisha's mother, the things she had endured, and the fact that no one had been there to stop it. That was the part that haunted Jack the most. The system had failed them, and now it was up to them to make things right. Jack stood up and walked back to the cabin, his resolve hardening. He couldn't let Aisha down. Not now, not ever. As he entered the cabin, he found Aisha sitting next to her mother, her head resting on the woman's shoulder. The sight made Jack's heart ache. Aisha was still just a little girl, and her whole world had been turned upside down. Jack crouched down in front of her, placing a hand on her shoulder. You okay? He asked, his voice gentle. Aisha looked up at him, her eyes tired but filled with a quiet strength. I'm okay, she whispered. I'm just scared. Jack smiled softly. I know, but we're going to make sure you're safe. You don't have to be scared anymore. Aisha's eyes flickered with uncertainty, but she nodded slowly, trusting him. Jack's heart tightened. He had to protect her. He had promised. And no matter what, he wasn't going to break that promise. He stood up, looking at the rest of the bikers. Tomorrow, we move. Get some rest while you can. As the bikers settled in for the night, Jack stayed awake for a little longer, watching over the cabin. He couldn't afford to let his guard down. Not yet. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers. But for now, they had a brief moment of peace. And Jack would make sure it lasted as long as it could. The morning arrived too soon, the light creeping through the trees and casting long shadows across the clearing. The cabin was quiet, but the tension in the air was palpable. Jack stood outside, his back to the door, staring out at the vast wilderness around him. The sounds of the bikes starting up one by one were the only noise breaking the stillness of the morning. The plan was set. They had to move quickly, but Jack couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He knew her stepfather would come for them soon. They couldn't afford to stay in one place too long. The cold mountain air bit at his face as he pulled his jacket tighter around him. His thoughts were scattered, focused on the next steps. He glanced over his shoulder at the cabin, the flickering light from the window revealing Aisha sitting beside her mother, who had managed to stay awake, but still looked pale and weak. Vince had done what he could, but the woman needed real care. Jack walked toward the others, the rest of the bikers gathering around their bikes, preparing to leave. We leave now? We keep moving, no matter what, Jack said, his voice low but firm. The bikers nodded in silent understanding. They had all been through their share of chaos, but this was different. This was personal. Jack knew they were all risking something. His mind flickered back to the promise he'd made to Tyrone. He couldn't afford to fail now. As the convoy revved its engines, Jack gave a final glance to the cabin, his chest tight with the realization that this could be the last time they saw it. The road ahead was uncertain, and there was no telling how long they would be able to keep Aisha and her mother hidden. They were in a race against time. The convoy moved out, the sound of engines filling the quiet mountain air. The roads were narrow and winding, the mountains towering on either side, giving them a sense of isolation, which Jack hoped would help keep them safe. The trees closed in, and Jack kept a steady pace, leading the group deeper into the rugged terrain. He kept his eyes on the road, scanning the area for any signs of danger. His mind kept replaying the plan. Get to the next location, stay hidden, and keep moving before her stepfather could catch up. But Jack knew that was easier said than done. Her stepfather had connections. He was no ordinary man. The fact that he was a cop made everything more complicated. Jack's eyes shifted to the rearview mirror. The convoy was still intact, the riders staying close, the rhythm of the ride comforting, but Jack couldn't let his guard down. They needed to keep their heads on a swivel. The landscape around them was a blur of green and brown, the trees thick and dense, blocking any clear view of what lay ahead. It was beautiful, but Jack couldn't afford to be distracted by it. He had a job to do. He had a family to protect. As the convoy continued along the winding path, Jack began to feel the weight of responsibility pressing down harder than before. The path ahead was long, and the risks were mounting. But there was no turning back now. Every mile they rode brought them closer to safety or closer to danger. And Jack wasn't sure which one it would be. They rode for hours, the sounds of the engines humming in the background, the scenery changing as they made their way through the mountains. Jack's mind was a constant whirl of thoughts. Aisha's mother, her stepfather, the bikers around him, and the promise he had made to Tyrone. They couldn't stay ahead forever. As the sun started to dip below the horizon, casting a golden light over the landscape, Jack called for a stop. He found a secluded area, hidden by trees and rocks, just far enough off the road to be unnoticed by anyone passing by. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. The bikers dismounted, stretching their legs and checking their gear. Jack walked to the edge of the clearing, his eyes scanning the road in the distance. His instincts told him they weren't alone, but he didn't see anything. Still, the feeling of being watched never left. Vince came up beside him, his face grim. "She's still not doing well," he said quietly. Jack nodded, his gaze still fixed on the road ahead. "I know. We need to move faster. I don't know how much longer she's got." Vince placed a hand on Jack's shoulder, his voice low but reassuring. "We'll get her somewhere safe. I won't let her die out here." Jack's throat tightened, the weight of their situation settling in. "We can't afford to wait much longer. Her stepfather's out there, and if he catches up to us, it's all over." Vince nodded. "I'll do what I can to keep her stable, but we need to keep moving." Jack turned back to the group, his eyes scanning the faces of the bikers who had gathered around. "We leave at dawn. We can't waste time. We need to get to the next safe house, and we need to do it now." The bikers didn't argue. They understood. They were in this together. No one spoke as they set up camp for the night, the sounds of the forest around them filling the air. Jack sat by the fire, his mind still racing. They had made it this far, but the hardest part was still ahead. They weren't safe yet, and Jack knew they wouldn't be until they were far from here, far from everything that could harm them. As the night grew colder, Jack stood up, his body tense with anticipation. "Stay sharp. We move at first light." The bikers nodded, their faces set in determination. Jack knew they couldn't afford to be anything less than ready. The journey ahead was filled with uncertainty, but there was one thing Jack was certain of: they weren't giving up. Not now, not ever. The first light of dawn broke through the trees, casting long shadows across the rugged mountain road. Jack stood outside, watching the rest of the bikers pack up camp, their movements quick and purposeful. The morning air was cold, biting at his skin, but he barely noticed. His mind was elsewhere, focused on the road ahead, on the promise he had made. Aisha and her mother had stayed inside the cabin, resting, trying to regain some strength after the grueling ride. Vince had managed to stabilize the woman, but Jack knew they couldn't afford to waste any more time. Her stepfather was still out there, and Jack couldn't let his guard down for even a moment. The bikers were ready to move. They had been on the road for days now, dodging her stepfather's reach, and Jack could feel the tension building. It wasn't just about getting Aisha and her mother to safety anymore. It was about taking a stand against everything they had been running from. Jack walked over to the group as they finished packing their bikes. He took a moment to survey the area, making sure everything was in place. The forest surrounding them was thick and quiet, the only sound being the rustle of leaves and the hum of distant engines. He turned back to the bikers. "We move out in 10. Stay tight and stay sharp," Jack said, his voice low but firm. Bear, the club's enforcer, looked up from his bike. "You really think he's still after us?" he asked, his voice laced with doubt. Jack nodded, his eyes steely. "He's a cop. He's not going to stop until he gets what he wants. We can't take any chances." Bear didn't argue. He knew better. The bikers had all seen enough to understand the stakes. Jack turned his attention to the van where Aisha and her mother were resting. Aisha was still small, still just a child, but she had seen more than most people in a lifetime. Jack felt a pang of guilt in his chest. She had been forced to grow up too fast. He couldn't undo what had happened to her, but he could make sure it didn't happen again. He had to keep her safe. They all had to stay safe. The engines roared to life as the bikers mounted their bikes and prepared to leave. Jack gave Aisha one last glance as he climbed onto his own bike. She was sitting in the van, staring out the window, her eyes distant. The fear in her gaze hadn't faded, but there was something else there now, something Jack couldn't quite place. Hope, maybe. He didn't have time to figure it out. They had to go. The convoy began to move, the sound of the motorcycles cutting through the stillness of the morning. Jack led the group down the narrow mountain road, the trees closing in around them as they descended deeper into the forest. The path was winding, the road narrow and treacherous, but Jack didn't slow down. Every turn, every bend, brought them closer to safety. But it also brought them closer to the inevitable confrontation. Jack could feel the weight of it pressing on him. He had no illusions about what was coming. Her stepfather would find them. It wasn't a matter of if, but when. They just had to be ready. They rode for hours, the convoy staying tight, their speed steady as they maneuvered through the mountains. Jack kept his eyes on the road, his mind running through all the possible outcomes, all the ways things could go wrong. But he didn't voice his doubts. The bikers needed to know he was in control. He couldn't let them see the cracks forming in his resolve. They stopped for a brief rest at midday, pulling off the road into a small clearing surrounded by dense trees. Jack dismounted, stretching his legs as the others checked their bikes and gathered around the campfire. Aisha and her mother remained in the van, and Jack knew they needed more time to rest. Vincent said they couldn't afford to wait much longer, but Jack didn't feel they were ready to push on just yet. He walked over to Bear, who was sitting by the fire, sharpening his knife. "How's the perimeter?" Jack asked. Bear glanced up, his eyes scanning the area. "Clear for now, but we're getting close to the town. We can't afford to be sloppy." Jack nodded. "We'll move out at dusk. We keep going until we find another safe place." Bear raised an eyebrow. "You sure? We're pushing hard already." Jack's eyes darkened. "We can't stop. We have to keep moving." As the sun began to set, the air grew colder. Jack's mind was restless, his thoughts flickering back to Aisha. What would her life be like once this was all over? Could they ever really escape the past? Jack didn't have the answers. But one thing was certain. He wasn't going to let anyone harm her again. The group gathered their things, ready to leave. Jack stood up, his face grim. "Let's go," he said, his voice firm. The engines fired up again, and they set off into the darkening mountains, the convoy moving like a shadow through the trees. The road ahead was uncertain, but Jack didn't falter. They were one step closer to safety, but he knew they couldn't let their guard down for a second. The fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. The convoy moved steadily through the winding mountain road, the sound of their engines cutting through the crisp night air. Jack led the way, his eyes constantly scanning the path ahead, every sense alert, every muscle tensed. The weight of what lay ahead was always on his mind, but tonight, there was something else weighing him down. Aisha, her mother. They had made it this far, but there was no guarantee they would make it any further. It had been days since they had left the cabin, but her stepfather's presence lingered, a shadow they could never quite escape. Jack knew that it was only a matter of time before they were found. The road ahead wasn't just about running away, it was about survival. As the miles passed, Jack's thoughts drifted back to the promise he had made to Tyrone all those years ago. He had sworn to protect Aisha, to ensure she would be safe. And now, as he rode through the night with the rest of the crew, he knew this was his final test. They could outrun her stepfather, but Jack knew that the true fight would be for Aisha's future. He couldn't let her go back to that life. He couldn't let her mother return to a man who would destroy everything she was. Jack wasn't sure how much longer they could keep moving, but they had to try. His fingers tightened around the handlebars of his bike, the leather of his gloves worn and familiar. They were all in this together, and no matter what happened, Jack wasn't going to leave them behind. Not Aisha, not her mother. As the convoy continued, the trees on either side of the road became denser, the path narrower. They had entered a more isolated area, and Jack knew they had to be careful. Their location was less than ideal, but it was the only place left where they could remain hidden. Aisha and her mother were in one of the vans behind them, and Jack felt the urgency to get them to safety before anyone could track them down. After a few more hours of riding, Jack signaled for the group to stop. They had reached a clearing, a small isolated area that seemed safe for now. The bikers dismounted, stretching their legs, checking their bikes, and starting small fires to keep warm. Vince, who had been monitoring Aisha's mother's condition closely, came over to Jack. She's stable for now, but she needs medical attention. We can't keep her here much longer, Vince said, his voice calm, but with an edge of concern. Jack nodded, his mind already working through the options. They couldn't risk taking her to a hospital, not with the danger of being found. But they also couldn't keep running forever. We'll figure it out, Jack said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. For now, we rest. We need to be ready for whatever comes next. As the group settled in for the night, Jack found himself standing outside, looking up at the stars. The silence around him was deafening, broken only by the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. He had been running for so long, trying to stay one step ahead, but the closer they got to safety, the more Jack realized that running wouldn't be enough. Her stepfather would come for them. He always did. The fight they were facing wasn't just about survival. It was about breaking the cycle, about standing up to a system that had failed them. Jack turned around, his eyes scanning the camp. The bikers were gathered around the fire, talking quietly. They had each faced their own battles, their own demons, but Jack knew none of them had ever faced anything like this. Aisha's mother, Aisha herself, they had all been pushed to the brink. And yet, here they were, still fighting, still together. Jack walked over to the group, the fire casting shadows across his face. He nodded to each of them, his voice steady. We leave tomorrow at first light. We get Aisha and her mother somewhere safe. Bear looked up, his face hard. And her stepfather? Jack's jaw clenched. We'll deal with him when the time comes. The group fell silent, each of them understanding the weight of Jack's words. It was only a matter of time before they would have to face him. The real battle was coming, and Jack wasn't sure if they were ready for it. But he knew they had no choice. They would fight, and they would win. They had to. The rest of the night passed quietly, the sound of the crackling fire the only noise in the otherwise still air. Jack lay awake, his thoughts racing. The road ahead was uncertain, and the danger was always lurking. But he wasn't going to let fear control him. He had come too far. They had come too far. The next morning, the sun rose slowly, casting a soft light across the forest. Jack woke early, the weight of the day ahead pressing down on him. He stood up, stretching his legs, and walked over to the van where Aisha and her mother were resting. Aisha was sitting up now, her small frame still tired but alert. Jack smiled at her, offering what little comfort he could. Ready to keep moving? Aisha nodded, her eyes still full of fear, but there was something else there too. Hope. She was still holding on. And as long as she was, Jack would never stop fighting for her. The convoy packed up quickly, the bikes roaring to life one by one. Jack mounted his bike, looking around at the group. They were ready. The time had come. The convoy took off, riding toward the unknown, the weight of the promise Jack had made still burning. In his chest, they would get Aisha and her mother to safety, no matter what it took. This was their fight now, and Jack wasn't going to let anything stand in their way.